Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I am Saad Shakil. I'm an ACCA member and a member of the IMA. Today we're going to be talking about cost management. And we're going to discuss the terminology related to cost management. The first term is direct material. Direct material is the physical substance that is used in the production of a product. For example, the threads in the production of clothes and the paper in the production of books, or the wood in the production of shelves, and so on. Next we have is direct labor, which is the effort of the people directly involved in the production process, such as the expenses incurred or that is being paid to the labor or to the tailor in the production of clothes. These are the expenses which are directly related to the production of the goods. There are certain expenses which are required for the production, but they're not directly related, such as the indirect material and the indirect labor. The indirect material and the indirect labor, as we mentioned, is the expenses which are required to be incurred for the production process to take place, but they're not directly related to the product itself. For example, when there's production going on in a factory and there's a lot of machinery being used, there are certain lubricants that would be used in order for the production and in order for the machinery to continue production smoothly. This lubricant is not directly involved in the production of that particular product that the machine is producing, but without the lubricant also you would not be able to continue production for a long time. This could be classified as indirect labor, indirect material. And the same goes for indirect labor. For example, the salaries paid for the supervisor in the factory. The supervisor himself or herself would not be producing anything, but in the absence of this supervisor, you would not be able to produce what you're producing. And then we have other operating costs. Other operating costs, together with the indirect material and the indirect labor, is going to be called as the manufacturing overhead. The other operating costs are the additional costs which are incurred other than the material and labor for the production of the product, but these are not directly related to this product. An example would be the rent for the premises, or the depreciation for the plant and equipment, and other such expenses without which, for example, the utility, the electricity, the water that's going to be utilized for the whole production process, but this would not be directly included as part of the product. To take this further, we're going to look into another terminology, which is the prime cost. Now, what we're trying to do here is not introducing new concepts, but trying to reclassify into these new terminologies. So, the prime cost, as you know, prime is the initial, the first thing. So, the basic cost of producing anything would be the direct materials and the direct labor that goes into producing this good or this product. The direct materials and the direct labor adds up to give us the prime cost. So, if we're going to say that in order to produce certain goods, there is a cost of $500 for direct materials, and there's another cost of $600 for direct labor, so the prime cost becomes $1,100. You would notice what we're excluding from this calculation of cost is the indirect material, the indirect labor, and the other operating costs. This cost is not considered while calculating the prime cost, because we are considering only the direct materials and the direct labor. The next term we have is conversion cost. The conversion cost is self-explanatory pretty much, is the cost of converting your raw material into the final good that's going to be produced by the enterprise. So, what is the cost that you incur in order to convert the direct material into the final product? you're going to use the labor, the direct labor, and the manufacturing overhead. The manufacturing overhead, as we have seen, is inclusive of the indirect material, the indirect labor, and other operating costs, which includes utility, as we said, and any additional costs in order to run the business, in order to make sure that the operations exist, such as admin salaries, or those expenses that are related to the manufacturing, without which manufacturing cannot take place. For example, the rent of the factory itself, and so on. So without this, you would not be able to convert your raw material into a final product. What is it that you require in order to convert this raw material into final product? You require the labor, the direct labor, of course, and also the indirect labor, which is part of the manufacturing overhead, the indirect material, and other operating costs. So this is going to combine to give us the conversion costs. From the exam perspective, you can expect to receive questions wherein you could be tested on the definitions of these terminologies. So you need to have a clear concept of what is prime cost, what is conversion cost, which costs can be considered as being manufacturing overhead and would not be part of the prime cost. Manufacturing overhead is excluded from the prime cost. But the conversion cost includes manufacturing overhead along with the direct labor, but direct material is being excluded. So it's direct material cost is not the cost of conversion. It's the thing which is going to be converted. And also, just by the way, in a multiple choice question scenario, you would generally have 4 options, out of which 2 could easily be ruled out, and the other 2 would be something wherein you need to take a decision on the basis of precision. That means you need to select the best option. And with regard to calculations, wherein you would have questions that include calculations of the cost or other calculations, it would benefit you to know, according to my observation, that the CMA questions would not have random numbers as options. Rather, each option would have been calculated using a wrong concept, except for the right answer, of course. So if you have a wrong concept and you make a calculation, so it's not time for you to be happy to see that option existent in the options or in the choices that you have, because you could have been calculating it on the wrong concept. So you have to learn your concepts and do the calculations on those bases. So you don't be expecting to have random numbers as the choices. Rather, they could be calculated numbers using the data or the information in the question itself. But the 3 options or the 3 choices which are not correct are based on the wrong concepts. Moving ahead in the terminology for the costs and looking at another type of classification, we have something called a variable cost. The variable costs, these are the costs that vary directly with the number of units that are being produced. That means, if you're going to produce more books, you need more paper. So the cost of paper is variable. It varies according to the number of books you're going to produce. What you would notice is, over here, the variable cost per unit is going to remain the same. If you're going to produce clothes or a shirt, let's say you're producing a shirt, and you're going to use a specific length of cloth, so this cost of the cloth is going to remain constant for each unit that you're going to produce. And the total cost would vary according to the variation in the production. So the total variable cost is going to vary according to the variation in the production units. We have a calculation of variable cost here. So the cost of each meter of cloth is $1. And the cloth which is used per unit is 0.5 meter, that's half a meter. And the number of units you're producing is 25,000. What would be the total variable cost? 1 unit of production, a shirt or whatever that might be, uses half a meter, and each meter costs you $1. So 1 shirt is taking $0.50. And you have 25,000 shirts or units of production. So half multiplied with 25,000, you have a total variable cost of $12,500. The concept that I want you to have very clear with you is the variable cost per unit remains the same, but the total variable cost keeps increasing. So the variable cost of producing one shirt or one unit of production remains $0.50, but the cost of producing more shirts is going to increase in the same ratio. So if you're going to produce 25,000 shirts, the variable cost would become 12,500. That means the total variable cost increased because there's an increase in production. If you're going to produce 50,000 units, the cost would increase from $12,500 to $25,000, and so on. Next we have is a fixed cost. These are the costs that remain constant in the short term. For example, rent for the factory. So you're going to have a contract for the one who's for the company or whoever is lending you this or renting you this piece of land and factory. You're going to pay rent to them as per the contract. It's not expected to increase or decrease. You basically have the same cost of rent throughout the periods. What you need to understand though is, in the long term, the fixed costs have a possibility of changing. And that happens when there is a change in the scale of production. So, for example, you're producing 500 units generally. If you're going to produce 501 unit or 502 units, or slightly more or less units, the rent of the factory would remain the same. But let's say you change the scale of production, wherein you're going to produce perhaps double the quantity that you were producing in the past, and you do not have that capacity in the existing factory. In that case, you would need to rent out more premises or increase the size of your factory, or you'd need to basically increase your fixed costs. So in the long term, that means when there's a change in the scale of production, the fixed costs are going to change also. But in the short term, they're going to remain the same. The total fixed costs remain the same. So if the rent of your factory is $50,000, that remains $50,000. But the fixed costs per unit is going to change, and it's going to decrease with an increase in the production. So your factory rent remains $50,000, but when you produce more, the per unit fixed cost is going to decrease. So if in this factory you're producing 500 units, so you have a fixed cost per unit of 50,000 divided by 500, which is $100 per unit. But if you're going to increase this production and you're going to produce 1,000 units, the fixed cost remains 50,000 as a total. But because it's going to be divided by 1,000 units now, so the fixed cost per unit becomes $50 per unit. So that's how we said that the total fixed cost is going to remain the same, but the fixed cost per unit is going to vary with a change in the level of production. We have another type of cost, which is the semi-variable costs. The semi-variable costs are simply costs which contain both a fixed component and a variable component within it. So it has a fixed charge and there's a per unit cost added to it. For example, for your telephone services, you might have a fixed charge that you're supposed to pay on a monthly basis for the telephone, and then on top of that you have to pay a bill which is calculated per minute of telephone usage or talk. Another example could be the example of labor. For example, you're required to pay labor a certain basic salary or certain basic wage, and anything above that would be calculated on the basis of the production. These costs would be called semi-variable because they're variable, but they also include a fixed component to them, so they're called semi-variable. There are a number of methods that can be used in order to calculate these semi-variable costs, and we're going to consider the one which is part of the syllabus for the CMA, which is the high-low method. Using the high-low method, and we have an example of 100 units incurring $4,000, 200 incurring $8,000, and 400 units incurring a cost of $13,000. And the question states, calculate the estimated cost of producing 300 units using the high-low method. And the reason why it specifies the high-low method is because there are other methods of a calculation of semi-variable costs, but the one we are concerned with, which is part of the CMA syllabus, is the high-low method. How we go about this? We're going to take the levels of production, which is the highest, which is 400, and the lowest, which is 100. And we're going to start comparing. You would notice that there's a difference of cost from 13,000 and 4,000. 4,000 is the cost of 100, 13,000 the total cost of 400. There's a difference of $9,000. And the difference in the number of units is 300 units. You have a total cost difference of 9,000 from when you're increasing production from 100 to 400. The total cost increases by $9,000 when there's an increase in production by 300 units. $9,000 for 300 units. It is presumed that this increase is the increase in the variable cost, because the semi-variable expenses or the costs have two components or two elements, the fixed and the variable. Of course, the fixed element is not going to change. So what has changed is the variable element. So the variable cost of producing this extra 300 units is $9,000, which means the variable cost of producing 1 unit is 9,000 divided by 300, which gives you $30 of variable cost per unit. So what we've done so far is we have calculated the variable cost of producing 3,000 units, or rather 1 unit, but if you're going to multiply that with 3,000, it's going to give you 9,000, which is the variable cost for producing the additional 300 units, right? So we have the variable cost with us, and the variable cost per unit is 30. Why we need this is so that we can check it with other numbers. So you can use this $30 of variable cost per unit and multiply it with 400 units. So for 400 units, of course, the total cost is the aggregate of the fixed costs and the variable costs. You don't know the fixed costs. The variable cost is 30 per unit. That makes, for 400 units, that makes it 12,000. The total cost, we know from the question, is 13,000. So the fixed cost would be the difference between the total cost and the variable cost, which is $1,000 in our example. Fixed cost of producing any number of units would be expected to be $1,000. So using this, now you have the fixed costs and you have the variable costs for 3,000 units. So for 3,000 units, the total cost is 1,000 fixed, 9,000 variable. That gives us a total of $10,000 of an estimated cost of producing 300 units using the high-low method. As we mentioned, that this is one of the methods of calculating an estimate of the semi-variable costs, but this is the one which is required by for your CMA examination. And this brings us to the end of this session. I hope to see you in the future. This is Saad Shakil signing off.